All right, let's get started. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Korea Society. And for today's program, Korea, a new history of South and North with Victor Cha and Ramon Pacheco Pardo. This is a program that we've been long waiting for. The famous Pink Book Tour has finally arrived in New York City at the Korea Society, and we are so happy to have Victor and Ramon. Allow me to introduce them. Professor Victor Cha is Distinguished University Professor, DS Song KF Chairholder, and Professor of Government in the Department of Government and School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He is also Senior Vice President for Asia and Korea Chair at CSIS in Washington, D.C. He's the author of 7 books, and he formerly served on the White House National Security Council, where he was responsible primarily for Japan, the Korean Peninsula, Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific Island nation affairs. Thank you for joining us, Victor, and welcome back. Homecoming in many different ways, and now on the board of the Korea Society. So delighted to have you.
Thanks. Great to be here. Great to see you, John.
And Ramon, welcome back, fresh off your appearance last year or 2 years ago doing Shrimp to Whale.
2 years ago, it must have been, yeah.
Okay, so very glad to have you back. Ramon Pacheco Pardo is Professor of International Relations at King's College London and the KF-VUB Korea Chair at the Brussels School of Governance. He is also King's Regional Envoy for East and Southeast Asia, helping to shape and implement the university's strategy for the region. He is Adjunct Fellow with the Korea Chair at CSIS and Non-Resident Fellow at the Sejong Institute. Both have very long and impressive resumes. Thank you for joining us. So this book asks a very important and under-examined question, which is, why have the two Koreas developed so differently in historically a relatively short period of time? The authors, as many of you already know, are renowned experts with decades of policy, academic, and personal experience working on the peninsula. They've sprinkled the text with insights from their own firsthand experience. Dr. Victor Cha and Dr. Ramon Pacheco Pardo are often not just passive observers, but are indeed participants in this history. We are flies on the wall as we read this book for a number of interesting and revealing vignettes that bring us face to face with North and South Korean officials and cultural events. It's rich in detail, packed with illuminating narratives, and it's fun to read. It's going to end up on a lot of syllabi coming up, including mine. Cha and Pardo write that, quote, Korea's modern history has been an odyssey driven by inexorable forces of geography, power, and resilience, end quote. Befitting a country whose destiny has turned equally by internal and external relationships, the book provides a balance of inside and outside perspectives, helping readers better understand Korea's evolution. At the same time, what I really like about this book is how it center stages Koreans in their own history. All too often, Koreans themselves are portrayed as reactionary or victimized. And although it's true that outside forces have cruelly intervened in Korea, there are also little-known stories that put Koreans themselves in the driver's seat. And they get to play a hand in their own destiny by playing great power politics, and those stories are on display here. This book doesn't simply tell a story, although it certainly does do that. It also provides the reader with analytical interpretations to understand systematic reasons behind the big turns in Korean history. Why do certain themes pop up over and over again? And we're going to get to talk about a few of those. Finally, I think one reason the presentation of this book is so helpful is because the history of one Korea really only makes sense in terms of the development of the other Korea. And North Korea tends to steal all the headlines through its bad behavior, but South Korea is equally compelling. And this book really makes a case for that. And unlike the North, we get a happy ending when it comes to South Korea. So welcome, Victor and Ramon. Let's start with the inspiration behind this book. How did we get here?
Well, first, thank you, Jonathan, and the Korea Society for hosting us this week. We have been on the East Coast doing some book talks, and this is the last of the talks. We save the best for the last.
Thank you.
It's good to see Jonathan. You know, Jonathan was a student of mine at Georgetown many years ago, and it just goes to show you can go to Georgetown, you can get a job when you graduate, right? So the other thing I should say is that many, many years ago, for those of you younger folks out there, I was an intern at the Korea Society when it was actually in the Asia Society building a long time ago. So long before Tom Hubbard, Don Gregg, even before those days.
Wow.
So my ties to the Korea Society run very, very deep. So both of us teach courses on Korea and Korean politics, Korean history, and for a long period of time, I would sign articles, but I could never really find the book that I wanted to assign that would sort of particularly give those in the class who don't have any background on Korea some background on Korea. Mm-hmm. And so what I used to assign all the time is a book that some of you may be very familiar with. It's a book called The Two Koreas by the late Washington Post reporter Don Oberdorfer. A terrific book, absolutely wonderful book, but it's 25 years out of date. Mm-hmm. Right? There's no mention of the person Kim Jong-un in the book, and there's no mention of Blackpink or BTS in the book, or Samsung semiconductor chips, or any of these sorts of things. So we wrote this book in part because we wanted to try to fill that void. Yep. In terms of teaching of Korea. So for students, for people who are going to Korea for the first time, for business people, C-suite people who are going to Korea for business and they need to pick up a book in the airport bookstore on the plane to Korea, and I've checked at LAX and SFO bookstores, and the book is there. Nice. You can check Kennedy tonight.
I will check tonight.
You check Kennedy
I will
Airport
check tonight.
And so that's part of what we were doing. The other thing I'll say is that we have been all over Europe talking about the book, and all the major cities in Western Europe. And the experience is unlike any book I've ever written. So this, as Jonathan said, is my 7th book, and it's just a completely different experience, a completely different audience. This audience is sort of atypical in that sense because all of you are related to the Korea Society in some fashion. Some of you may be members. If you're not a member, you should join. Speaking as a board member, as a not a member, you should join the Korea Society. But when we were speaking in Madrid or Berlin or Paris, the room was filled with people who knew nothing about us and really nothing about Korea except for K-pop or Korean dramas or Korean food. Mm-hmm. And so our entry point to Korea are things like North Korean nuclear weapons or something. But their entry point to Korea is all of these other things, right? In terms of Netflix and all that sort of stuff, and they're very interested. That has been their entry point to Korea, and they want to learn more than just like K-pop. And so they were drawn to this book and its hot pink cover. They were drawn to it, and so it's been a very different experience, and one I'm grateful for.
Excellent. And I'll just stop to remark that both of your tie game today is very strong. We've got the U.S.-Korean flag over here and then the matching pink, over there with Ramon. So Ramon, over to you. Inspiration for the book.
And the pink, of course, is on purpose. So in my case, I come from Spain and I lived in Korea first time 2003, 2004, right? And when I was going there, my friends, I was at university, my friends said, okay, I'll give you some gift, so you know more about the country where you're going to, because in Spain, we don't really study Asian history, never mind Korea, in school, right? Now you can study at university, but back then it wasn't even possible. And they gave me a Lonely Planet guidebook, right? Which has a really short history of Korea, like really, really tiny. It's about restaurants, bars, you know those guides, right? And that one was a book by a Spanish journalist who was a China correspondent and had written a book that he claimed was about North Korea. But it was really about China and North Korea relations, right? So there was nothing. And as Victor said, the Oberdorfer book is very good, right? But it is outdated by now, and I think because Korean culture maybe was as well known back then, it doesn't really cover culture either, right? We're doing this book along with society, politics, and economics, technology. And so on. So it was really about writing a book that I wish I would have had when I went to Korea first time, right? And I didn't know the history of the country, and I just wanted an introduction to it.
Excellent. Well, I think you've accomplished what you set out to do. So let's go back in history and talk about Korea in the late 1800s and this debate of whether Korea should open up or not, is often characterized as a choice that was foisted upon it by external powers. But there was also the degree to which Koreans themselves were debating that choice. So I wonder if, Victor, maybe you could talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure. So we start the book in 1876, the Ganghwa Treaty, Treaty of Ganghwa, which was Japan's first effort to open Korea to trade and to decrease Chinese influence in Korea. And we start there as the entry point because we talk about the history of modern Korea exhibiting this theme of Korea's geographic position is often its geostrategic destiny, right? In the sense that as a country relatively small in the middle of East Asia, that is both a continental power because it's connected to the continent, and a maritime country as it juts out into the ocean. It was in many ways that physical feature alone engaged the interests of all the major powers in the region: Russia, China, Japan, and the United States. And so, as was the case in the late 19th century, early 20th century, you had these balance of power politics, geostrategic forces swirling around the Korean Peninsula at a time when Korea was internally very weak. The Yi dynasty was falling apart. There was an intense debate within Korea between those who wanted to follow the path of modernization, like the West, and those who were more Confucian traditionalists that wanted to just pick parts of modernization but not fully adopt Western ways. And so this combination of balance of power politics around the Korean Peninsula and Korea's internal weakness created a situation in which external forces determined Korea's fate. Right? This was not just the case in the late 19th century, when there were two major power wars over Korea in a period of a decade, right? The Sino-Japanese War, the Russo-Japanese War, an alliance between Japan and the United Kingdom, and then, of course, a deal between the United States and Japan to basically yield influence over Korea to Japan in return for U.S. influence over the Philippines, right? But this was something that we saw during the Japanese occupation, and then we saw it after the end of the Japanese occupation when Korea was liberated, but again, internally very weak, lots of balance of power politics swirling around, this time the start of the Cold War, and Korea's fate was again decided by external powers, cut in half, right? Divided at the waist, right? At the 38th parallel. The 38th parallel that divides the Korean Peninsula has no natural geographic feature. It is not a natural place at which you would try to divide a country. It cuts across mountain ranges, through rivers, across provinces, entirely imposed by external forces, right? And we open with this theme because it's a powerful one, but we come back to it in the end of the book because geopolitics will always swirl around the Korean Peninsula, but now Korea is a lot stronger. Both Koreas are a lot stronger than they were where we open the book.
Another historical theme that's very much alive today is Japanese colonization, and you even wrote one of the stories, History is Alive, after watching a particularly emotional South Korean official react to a modern incarnation of this relationship. So looking back, what should we learn from Japanese colonization? What should be the legacy here? Because this is something that remains such an important and prominent feature of South Korean politics.
You want to go, or
Yeah, go ahead.
you go ahead?
Okay.
Yeah.
So, one point we make, this is never going to go away, right? I mean, it's always going to be there. I come from Spain. We colonized many parts of Latin America 200 years after decolonization. Mexico, for example, still raises this as an issue with Spain. You know, we see it with India and the UK, with Congo and Belgium. So I always make the point, this is not going to go away, but this doesn't need to define the relationship between Korea and Japan, right? It's going to be there. for domestic reasons in both countries, and as it happens in other former colonies. But then, as we see recently, right, the countries can have a good and improving relationship. Plus, if you look at young people in Korea and Japan, I mean, for Koreans, one of the first places they want to visit is Japan. For Japanese, it's the same, right? I mean, last summer when after the pandemic was first time reopening, the number of Japanese tourists in Korea, Myeongdong, it was amazing, the number of tourists, right? So we do make the point that this doesn't necessarily need to define the relationship between the two Koreas, or in this case, South Korea and Japan, but that's something that is going to be part of domestic dynamics in Korea, as it does in many other countries, and that is going to be part of the equation. But going back to the point that Victor made, towards the end of the book, we explain that the Koreas are not weak anymore, right? That its fate is not going to be defined by outside powers. And this also means that the way Korea can engage with other countries, not only Japan, but with other countries, South Korea and North Korea, is very different today, right? And we see that in the case of South Korea-Japan relations, how this improvement relations that we have seen in recent months and years is very much predicated on this idea that South Korea doesn't have to look back in its relationship with Japan. It can actually look forward because it is in a position of a strength, right? And weakness doesn't define Korea anymore, and the past colonization doesn't define Korea anymore. As I said, you see this when young people in Korea as well, when South Korea, when they ask about the perceptions of Japan, and yes, of course, the legacy of colonialism is not gone, but they see it in a different way, as an equal, right, as a fellow developed country, democracy, technologically advanced, market economy, right? So they see the commonalities as well. And that's one of the points that we try to tease out in the book, right? That today, the Koreas are in a very different position from when they were in the late 19th century, or even 1950, at the start of the Korean War, 1945, when we had the division of Korea. And that's something that we should recognize, and that we explain in the book why this is the case, why the Koreas have reached this point, and especially South Korea.
Great answer.
I agree.
That's how you handle it like a pro. All right, Korean War. Let's talk about Korean War, another piece of history which is alive today. So last year marked the 70th anniversary of the armistice, which ended the Korean War. And this was a war that turned on miscalculations, on mixed messages, and misperceptions. One might posit that those three factors remain at play today. It was an ideological competition, a superpower collision, and the first hot war of the Cold War. And of course, it was a human tragedy. And it's not over. So what lesson should we learn from the Korean War?
Well, you're right. It's not over, right? It is still technically armistice, not a peace treaty ending the war. Although there has been peace on the peninsula since 1953. I mean, it's hard to say. There clearly are lessons in the sense of how we think about what was the Cold War fought over, right? So the Korean War is popularly known as the Forgotten War. When veterans came back from World War II, they were celebrated with ticker tape parades, right? Down the what I guess today is called the Canyon for Heroes, right? That's where the Yankees and everybody, they were celebrated. But when people came back from the Korean War, right, there was no celebration, right? A terrible war was fought basically to the same place where it started. But I think, as President Obama said, and I think it was Ambassador An Ho-young first said, the Korean War should not be the forgotten war. It was a victory, right? It was a victory in the sense that if people want to know what the Cold War was fought for and what it was fought over, it was fought over things like South Korea. And so South Korea today is what's their eighth largest economy, whatever it is, eighth or 12th largest economy in the world. The only country that went from being a net donor recipient to a net donor provider, the only OECD country that's increasing its budget for development assistance, second largest Peace Corps volunteer network in the world next to the United States. And if you think about all the, K-pop, the fact that all of you have some sort of Samsung device in your on your body right now or in your home. This is what the Cold War was fought over, right?
Mhm.
This is what it was fought over. So I entirely agree with President Obama when he said that. Like, I thought that was a really great way to put it. This was not the forgotten war. It was a war that was won.
Yeah.
And so that's the most important lesson that I gather from it.
Excellent. Ramon, anything on that one?
Yeah, I mean, from coming from Europe is a different perspective, as you can imagine, right? Because for us, the Korean War, of course, many European countries joined, supporting the South, and they were always supporting the North, at least with materials as well. And in Europe, it's not even the forgotten war; it's a war you don't really even talk about, know about at all, right? But then, as we describe later on in the book, if we look at the difference between South Korea and North Korea today, and we explain why they are different, right? And we can talk about this in a second if you want, right? Without the U.S. running the troops in support of the South, this may not have happened, right? And it did happen thanks to how South Koreans fought against the North Koreans, as also international support. But again, the fate of the Koreas, you could argue, was decided by the big powers, right? The vote in the United Nations, obviously that was vote led by the US when the Soviet Union was boycotting, and it was the US that sent the troops and supported. And then when North Korea was about to be defeated, it was the Chinese who actually supported North Korea and for it not to be defeated, right? So it was still a fairly weak country, but after the war, obviously this laid the foundations to the different trajectories of the two countries.
Yeah. And I love the European perspective here because at the time, remember, this was all about the U.S. being primarily focused on the Atlantic theater and overlooking the importance of Asia and disregarding the integration of those two theaters. And that was something that Stalin recognized and could manipulate the United States on the basis of. And some would argue that the same mistake could possibly happen today, right? With America thinking that we can't walk and chew bubblegum at the same time, support Ukraine and Taiwan, and our allies throughout Asia and also our allies in Europe. So potentially a lesson here in that. I want to get to the post-war period and the state building, talk about the differences between what was happening in the North and what was happening in the South. This is something that the book covers in depth and really learn a lot here. So can you, who wants to take this one? Ramon?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about the importance of political leadership, and I'm borrowing or stealing from Victor here. We don't want to make this a social science experiment, but if you're going to develop a social science experiment about the importance of politics and leadership, the Korean Peninsula is the perfect place, right? Because after the division of the country and the Korean War, you had the same people in the south and in the north, right? Two equally poor countries. If anything, North Korea had better prospects. So we do mention in the book in 1959-60 when World Bank officials went to South Korea, and we quote from the report, they essentially said, well, we have to give up on South Korean development. It's not going to happen. This is going to be an agrarian economy. Maybe can develop some textiles, some comments that today we would say they were a bit racist about South Koreans themselves, right? But what we saw is that political leadership matters hugely, right? Because same people, similar circumstances. By the 1970s, 80s, very clearly, South Korea was more developed, more advanced than the North. And we explained that even though both of them were authoritarian regimes, right? In North Korea, we had the cult of personality. That was the focus of the regime, keeping the family in power, the cult of personality, not necessarily developing the economy of the country for the well-being of the whole population, right? Because from the 1960s, 70s, you start to see, especially in the 1980s as well, these big monuments being built in honor of the Kims, right? Back then, especially Kim Il-sung, later on his son as well. And in the South, yes, you had an authoritarian regime, of course, right? But at the same time, it was a regime that wanted South Korea to be able to compete with Japan, to compete with the US, to compete with Western Europe in economic and technological terms, right? You had this regime that had very high hopes and some people would say dreams, right? That one day technologically this country would be as advanced as many others. When the World Bank was saying, don't even think about it, this is not going to happen, right? And obviously we'll talk about the importance of the people as well. In the North, extremely repressive regime, right? The seeds of what we see today, which is large amount of concentration camps, huge control over the population. In the South, yes, you do have the repression, so we shouldn't forget about it. But the people were able to develop their own well-being, right, through their own work. In the North, this wasn't possible under the political system that the country had. And then we get to the 1980s, and again, the importance of leadership. We have South Koreans fighting for democracy, and a leadership that recognizes, or at least is forced to recognize, whichever you want to put it, that the time for democracy has come.
Mm-hmm.
In the North, the opposite. We see the collapse of communism in the late 1980s, early 1990s, right? Many Central Eastern European leaders also realizing we cannot continue with the system. It just doesn't work. Some of them, of course, like Ceausescu in Romania, was removed from power violently, but many others just gave up, right? Yeah. And the North could have decided, well, maybe we have to give up, and they didn't, right? And the Kim family doubled down on repression. So we do point out the importance of leadership, right, in creating these very different outcomes, all the way until we are today. But going back all the way to the 50s, 60s, when many thought North Korea is going to do better, it has more resources, has the support of the Soviet Union, and it has the support of China. The South, lost case.
Yeah.
And it went the other way, thanks to the politics of the different countries, the leadership, but also the people, how free they were to express themselves economically and later on politically in the case of South Korea.
So let's talk about one of those leaders in South Korea, and that's Park Chung-hee. So you call Park Chung-hee the most consequential figure in the 20th century and the key driver behind its transformation from rags to riches. And of course, there's also a mixed legacy there because of the authoritarianism. So how should we look back at Park Chung-hee?
So with a mixed legacy, so you answer the question. So what do we have here? South Korea wasn't the only country with an authoritarian regime back then, right? If Spain, Portugal, Greece. In the case of Europe, for example, of course, we have many communist regimes. Taiwan, right next to Korea as well. And this shouldn't be forgotten. And obviously, younger generations of South Koreans, they do remember the politics sometimes more than the economics of it, right? Because they have grown up in an affluent, developed Korea, so they don't remember the struggle for development, right? As the parents, grandparents generation may do, but they're very protective of the democracy, right? So that's why they have this view of Park that might be a bit more negative, right? But those who live through this period of time, and we discuss this in the book, they remember when the country was not poor, it was beyond poor, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like people dying of hunger. All these people, all these kids that had to be adopted overseas, right? Because the country couldn't feed, right? Their own orphans. So they do remember that, and obviously they remember the economic development that took place during this period of time. So they focus more on that. Plus, obviously, at that point in time, after the Korean War, you didn't know if North Korea was going to attempt a new invasion.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, you had the alliance with the U.S., but many South Koreans thought, maybe Kim Il-sung will decide that the time has come for another invasion of the South. So you remember that as well, the protection against communism and the North Korean regime. So the mixed legacy is clearly there. But I go back to the point that I made before. It is a mixed legacy. One day, when North Korea is not here anymore, I don't think there's going to be a mixed legacy about the Kims. It's going to be a very negative legacy, right? A negative view about the Kims, right? In the case of Park, yes, you had the repression component, and we shouldn't forget about it. But there is a very positive story to tell when it comes to the economic development of the country and the leadership that he exercised, as I said, in opposition to the view of the international community, who was telling him, don't dream about becoming an advanced economy, you are not going to achieve it.
Right.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that very good answer is Park Chung-hee's legacy is indeed mixed, but you got to give him credit for being able to make rational economic decisions. Right? He was a dictator, for sure. Yushin period was one of the darkest periods in Korea. The Yushin period was one of the darkest periods in Korean politics, right? Mm-hmm. Extreme suppression. But he was able to make the rational economic decision, and the rational economic decision at the time was to normalize relations with Japan. Mm-hmm. That normalization of relations with Japan, very unpopular in 1965. Right? The streets were afire with protests. Mm-hmm. But it was able to give Korea low-interest loans, right? Technology that enabled the start of the heavy industry, shipbuilding, steel, cars, right? It was the start of the Korean economic boom. You go over to you go over and look at North Korea, and you ask the question like, closed political system, but why can't they make rational economic decisions?
Mm-hmm.
Why can't the leadership make rational economic decisions? And I think the difference is that Park Chung-hee was for certain, a dictator, a military dictator, but he wasn't a cult of personality
Mm-hmm.
leadership like we have in the Kim family. And so I think in many places, in other places, Vietnam, other places, we've seen dictatorships that can make rational economic decisions, but cult of personality leaderships cannot.
Yeah.
Right? And that is basically the problem with North Korea.
And yeah, so I want to build on this because we wonder about rationality of North Korea as an actor, and I think we have to think about the interests of Kim Jong-un rather than the interest of North Korea as a state at large. So you write that North Korea's development of nuclear weapons, despite multiple rounds of agreements and declarations to the contrary, was perhaps inevitable. So I wonder if you could dig into the inception of North Korea's nuclear weapons program and why it's been so resistant to give it up.
So I think the reason we say, at least I think the reason we wrote that it's inevitable is because I think the North Korean nuclear program is not a function or derivative of some sort of external security threat. So yes, it is very true that the country across the border, South Korea, is allied with the most powerful military in the history of humanity, right? The United States, right? There's no doubt about that. And you have Japan right there as well. So that certainly is a very intimidating environment. But of course, we know that the reason the United States or South Korea have not attacked North Korea is because North Korea has a very capable deterrent, which is thousands of artillery tubes that could turn Seoul into a sea of fire within 8 minutes, 10 minutes, right? So unless the United States and South Korea are willing to take huge cost or even be suicidal, North Korea faces an external security threat, but that external security threat is deterred.
Mm-hmm.
What is creating the insecurity in North Korea that drives them in the direction of nuclear weapons is internal, right? And again, I go back to leadership and the nature of the leadership. Leaderships like the one we see in North Korea never feel secure.
Mm-hmm.
They are always insecure, and they are afraid of their own population as much as they are any external threat. So when we used to negotiate, when I was involved in negotiations with North Korea, they would always say their nuclear program is because of U.S. hostile policy. And I would say, okay, define for me what is U.S. hostile policy. And they say, well, you're just hostile to us. And I said, I know, but can you please operationalize that for me so I know what we can try to do to alleviate your concern about U.S. hostile policy? And there would be silence. And I would say, so is it the military exercises, right? Is it our troops in Japan? Is it our troops in Korea? Is it, what is it? What is it that you can point to and we'll try to fix it? Is it our economic sanctions? Is it all? And they would never operationalize that. They would never say what it is. Because, and I think, for one, they didn't want to say what it is because we would remove that thing and they'd still say you're still hostile. But I think the other reason is because the threat to North Korea really is inherent in the nature of the regime. The leaderships like we see in North Korea will always feel threatened, right? It's like Stalin. Did Stalin ever feel secure? Mm-hmm. He was always felt threatened, right? All dictators feel like that. So that's in part what we mean by inevitable.
Yeah, great answer. And as we go down this dark and gloomy path with North Korea, on the other side of the peninsula, things are starting to look up a lot. So Ramon, wonder if you could talk to us about South Korea's democratic transition.
Yes, we we spend quite a bit of space on this, right? Because we consider this to be essential to understand where Korea is today. South Korea, not only in political terms and economic terms, but also in cultural terms, which, as Victor said, when we were touring in Europe, 80% of the audience was interested in culture, right? And this wouldn't have been possible without the democratic transition and the freedom that came afterwards, including for artists. So we do explain the confluence of different factors and different forces throughout the 1980s, right? We have the student movement, workers' movement, religious movements as well. The so-called necktie by grade, right? People who are going to the office, and then after going to office, they would go out to protest against the regime. We also explain that this is when the women's movement in Korea is becoming more powerful, right? In the 1980s, mid 1980s, we have the first women's congress in Korea, right? And we see all these forces coming together and really forcing the hand of the government to admit that the time has come for the country to become a democracy, right? That the economic well-being of the people is great, but now they want the political well-being that for them was being a democracy. And we do explain how all of these factors came together at this point in time, with the pinnacle, obviously, of 1988, the Coming Out Party, which, as you probably know, right, was meant to be a celebration when it was awarded to South Korea, a celebration of the strength of the dictatorial regime that got the Olympics for Korea, but eventually became a celebration of freedom, right? And the political transition the country had. 1992, we had the elections in Spain, my own country, and it was very similar, right? For it was a celebration of Spain having made it, right? Not only economically, but also politically. So I can relate to this. At a personal level, I can understand the feelings of the Korean people, how proud you feel about what you have achieved, which is like, we're a democracy now, and we can actually show this to the rest of the world, right? As a celebration. And then we link it to what I just described, right? That's the transition means also a cultural transition, and the people being free to express themselves in the way they want. And this is also the start of Korean dramas, movies, pop music, right? Changing in Korea, not being censored, and obviously becoming what it is today. So that's why we don't focus only on the period itself, but what the period has meant for what has happened later in Korea. And we put this in contrast to North Korea, that went the other way, right? Yep. As communist countries were folding and transitioning to democracy, including Soviet Union, right? The leader of the communist camp. North Korea doubled down on repression, yeah. Right? And in that particular chapter, or throughout the book, actually, what we do is we don't look at the North and then the South. We look at both of them together, right? Because we explain that from our perspective, it is not possible to understand what was going down in the South, this democratization path, and separate this from what was going on in the North, which was taking the opposite direction of more repression, among other things because of the fear that something similar might happen in the North.
Yeah. And Victor, I wonder if we could talk about Nordpolitik, because you did such a great job earlier today.
Yeah, so Nordpolitik, or Northern Policy, was a policy in the late 1980s, started in the late 1980s, 1990, by the government of Noteu, that was largely trade diplomacy, in the sense the idea was economics without politics, that South Korea could trade and do business with countries in Eastern Europe and even China and the Soviet Union without regard for politics, right? And so it was a commercial policy that was meant to capitalize on Korea's growth. You know, the coming out party in 1988 after the Olympics. Like, people forget, many of you weren't even born then, but the 1988 Olympics was a very important Olympics, because the 1984 Olympics was boycotted by the Soviet Union in LA, and the 1980 Olympics was boycotted by the United States and Western countries because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1975. So many people thought the Olympic movement was dead, that the Cold War had killed the Olympic movement, because the Olympics was supposed to be about putting politics aside and everybody comes together for 2 weeks, right, of sport. So people thought that we were done. Like the Olympics, or the Olympic movement from starting in 1890, whenever it was, is crushed. Like it's never going to be the same again. And then South Korea had the 1980 Olympics. So and they worked very hard, right, to convince the Soviets to come, to convince the Chinese to come, right? As you know, I wrote a book about this. So but so on the platform of that, because Korea was successful at getting all these Eastern European countries, Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union, to participate in the 1988 Olympics, they used that as a platform to expand commercial relations. But the other aspect of it, that was the sort of outward-facing aspect, but the other inward-facing, more national security aspect of that was once you establish trade relations and businessmen and women start going to, Hungary, Romania, Poland, these other places, once they start going there, then you need to have consular services, right? So then this starts leading to the creation of consular services, which is the first step to building the political relationship. So eventually, these all end up as political relationships, normalized political relationships with all these Eastern Bloc countries that were allied to North Korea, right? So now South Korea is recognized by all of these countries, friends of North Korea. Of course, the biggest fish to catch was the Soviet Union. And again, using the platform of the Olympics in 1988, Nordpolitik by South Korea with the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, right, and his desire to connect the Soviet Union to the economic dynamism of East Asia, eventually led to the normalization of relations in 1990 between the Soviet Union and South Korea. That normalization of relations from a commercial standpoint was a big deal, but from a political national security standpoint was the brass ring, if you will, right? They had gotten the Soviet Union, North Korea's primary security and economic benefactor, to normalize relations with South Korea and to also be indebted to South Korea, right? Because normalization came with a $3 billion economic loan from South Korea to the Soviet Union. 2 years later, the same thing with China, right? 2 years later in 1992, normalized relations with China. And without the other part of that happening, right? North Korea and Japan, no economic relations, no normalization. North Korea and the United States, no economic relations, no normalization. So Northern diplomacy in that sense was both a commercial policy, and it was also a national security policy. And then the third part of it, which deserves mention, is that the normalization of relations with the Soviet Union and China allowed South Korea to accomplish something else that they had long sought, right? And that was a seat in the United Nations. It's actually extraordinary if you think about it, right? It's extraordinary. South Korea was a sovereign nation from 1948 when it was declared, 1948, and it was not a member of the United Nations until 1991, right? It was a sovereign country and was not a member of the United Nations. It's extraordinary if you think about it. It wasn't too long ago, right? And even more extraordinary when you think about that it went from being a country that joined, it had observer status in the UN, but it could not vote, right? It could not do it, it could not sit on the UN Security Council, none of those things. So normalization of relations with the Soviet Union through Nordpolitik basically was one of the key factors that led the Soviet Union to not oppose a two-country solution for UN membership for the two Koreas, right? And this was something that the South Koreans wanted. It was not something the North Koreans wanted. When the Soviet Union told North Korea about this, they got very upset, right? Extremely upset about it. But it was a hugely important moment. And of course, extraordinary when you think about only a few years later, the Secretary General, right, of the United Nations, right? The Secretary General of the United States Nations was a Korean, right? Ban Ki-moon, who happened to endorse our book.
Yes. It's in the cover.
Yeah, on the cover. Yeah, yeah.
An excellent mixture of outstanding history and visions for the future.
He knows.
Ban
He
Ki-moon.
knows.
So, Ramon, I want to talk about transformed gender roles in
Hmm.
the North and the South in the 2000s. Very different circumstances, but women on both
Hmm.
sides of the 30th parallel enjoying some newfound freedoms and responsibilities.
So I think for us that was important. If you read many books on Korean history, they don't really mention women's movement of feminism, right? But in the case of the two Koreas, as you know, has been very important. So we'll start with the North, right? We have the famine in the 1990s, as you know, right? And we have the marketization of the economy because the North Korean people have to survive. They're not being provided by their own leadership. And we see these markets being launched, right? And men, they still have to go to their factories. They still have to go to their offices to pretend they actually have a job when they actually don't, right? But in order to be able to feed the population, women especially, right, they start to launch these markets, right, trading, going back and forth with China, selling goods that they can smuggle or bring back from China. And you have these female-led markets because they are the ones who can actually go to the market. They don't have to go to a factory. They don't have to go to another state job, and of course they don't have to serve in the military, right? We have a very long military service in North Korea, and this transforms the role of women within society, right? Because they are the main breadwinners up to this day for most North Korean families. So that gives them obviously power that they didn't have. In the case of South Korean families, um, very interesting because sometimes you read that well feminism in South Korea is something new, goes back to the Me Too movement. It's not really true. I mean the origins go back to the 60s and 70s, right? Became powerful in the 80s, but then by the 1990s 2000s, when you have democratization, you have more freedoms for everyone, really, for everyone within society, and then you have the 97 financial crisis. You see more and more women saying, well, when I get married and I have kids, I don't want to stop working, right?
Mm-hmm.
I want to continue in my job, which is obviously very natural, but for many in the 1980s was not the right state of affairs, or even the 1990s. So explain this, right? How from the in my case, I lived in Korea first time 2003, 2004, and with my female friends or male friends, really, in university, this is something that you would discuss, right? Outside of the classroom, you go to a bar or a cafe. I was a student, so more to the bar than the cafe, I guess. The sulchi, right? and you discuss these things, right? And you could see how the thinking was, well, I want to be working in any sort of career that I want. I don't want to be constrained in the way that many women felt in the 1980s, 1990s. We also talk about Kim Jong-na, the first and the famous ice skater who won the Olympics, the gold medal in ice skating in 2008, right? And this was a model for many women. Said, oh, you can be the best a Korean woman can be the best in the world, literally the best in the world, for some the best in history when it comes to this particular discipline. So we also talk about role models, right? And how role models became important during that period of time. Not that it didn't exist before, but this one was iconic for many Koreans.
Absolutely. So let's talk about unification, and then we're going to get to your audience questions. So please get ready. We'll run a microphone over to you. So it's easy to be skeptical about unification and cast it as an impossible dream, especially that Kim Jong-un has now denounced it. But I really like the way that this book addresses the topic. It shows that division is a historic aberration, that even hardened views can change, and that both Koreas and the world have a lot to gain rather than just lose through unification. So where are we now on unification, and how have the views sort of evolved over time?
So we do finish the book by talking about unification because I think it's very difficult to write a history of Korea, modern history of Korea, without talking about the future, and the future, entails unification. It would almost seem like blasphemy to write a book about Korea and not talk about unification because you'd almost be admitting that it will not be unified. And so we go through the book and talk about the different discourses on unification that have changed quite a bit on the South Korean side. They've been fairly consistent on the North Korean side, but they've changed quite a bit on the South Korean side over time and depending on which government was in power. Um, and then one of the things that we also talk about in the book is how there are generational differences in how South Koreans look at unification. Older generations tend to think about it in normative terms as something that should happen, something that is a good thing, while younger generations that did not experience the Korean War, never knew of a united Korea, even if it was under foreign occupation, have lived in an affluent South Korea as educated individuals. The only Korea they know is the one that they lived in, and the notion of a divided Korea, a North Korea, is just something they read about in history books. Younger Koreans were polled and asked the question, like, how many times a week do you think about North Korea? And the respondents were like, how many times do I think about North Korea in a week? Like, you mean like in a month? Or maybe in like every quarter, every financial quarter? How often do I think about North? It's just not on the radar screen. And so there are very big generational divides there. We also present novel data in the book about how North Koreans think about unification. And it's very different from the way South Koreans think about it. North Koreans actually are much more positive on unification. They see it in normative terms, something that should happen, something that's good, something that should happen. But it's not for the reasons you would expect. It's not because of the economic benefit, right? Because North Korea arguably could benefit a lot more economically. It's largely because of ethnic identification. North Koreans feel like Korean people, as Koreans, we should be united. So that was one of the more interesting findings that came out of the work. But so that's where we end the book, except for the epilogue for the paperback edition, which is coming out later. That's sort of, I think, a fitting place to end a book on the history of modern Korea.
So I guess I'll end with one final question before going to our audience, and that's, is there anything that makes you hopeful about the future of Korea? What's the thing that sticks out to you most that you're excited about for how Korea will develop going forward?
Mm-hmm. On the question of unification, I think we end up in a hopeful note, right? Indicating that as much as Victor has said, right, young Koreans, South Koreans may feel, well, I'm not particularly keen on unification, but we do make the point that when the time comes, the people will rally behind the cause, right? And yes, there will be cost, of course, like in Germany, for example, but there are also many benefits, right? Yeah. Beyond the history of the country as a unified entity for hundreds, if not thousands of years, right? So that's something hopeful we focus on in the book. And when it comes to the South, Victor's mentioned in the epilogue, the culture, as you can imagine, right? 20 years ago, some people were saying, oh, this is peak Korea, you know? Korean culture, Hallyu, so popular in Japan, so popular in China, Taiwan, Southeast Asia, but that's it, right? Then Gangnam Style comes out, oh, this is it, right? This is the peak of Korean culture, you know, it's popular everywhere across the world. Here we are, 2024, right? And you look at Netflix, 5 of the 10 most streamed non-English language dramas, they are Korean. Yeah, the other 5 being Spanish, actually. 5 seasons of the first Spanish, or the same Spanish show. So I'm very proud because I can follow both of them, right? And last year, we saw all these different K-pop bands touring and making record profits, right? Actually, in February, a similar panel to this, not on Korea, but on Asia, right? I was hosting the Taiwanese ambassador to Belgium, right? And we ended up talking about K-pop. We said, oh, I'm going to London because, you know, my daughter really likes you, the famous actress and singer, right? So we're going there, completely sold out. And I love Blackpink. I really like them, right? So I was like, well, I love Blackpink. So maybe I'll see you there next time, right? So that makes me very hopeful, right? That people talk about peak Korea. And I think we have been talking so much about peak Korea that, yeah, at some point, it cannot become more popular, right? Mm-hmm. Cannot go any higher, but it will be up there. Mm-hmm. Right, and that's something that I always tell Koreans because we get these questions all from Korea. It's like, oh, you know, our cultural technology and focus on culture, but our technology, our economy, you know, it's not going any further. It's like, well, you've been saying that for decades now, and you keep growing, right? So that makes me very hopeful about the South.
Great answers.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'll add is that when we started the event, you talked about Korean resilience. You mentioned that as one of the themes of the book, and I think it's an important one. I mean, Korea has this uncanny ability historically over the decades, over the millennia, to snatch. Okay. This ability to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat, right? There are many times when Korea was on the precipice, when it sat on the precipice. The financial crisis, right? The Korean War, the financial crisis, the summer of 1987, when the question was, is the government going to roll tanks through the streets as the Chinese did in Tiananmen Square in 1989, right?
And you were in Korea,
Yeah, I was in Korea at
weren't
the
you?
time. Yeah. What are they going to do? And each time Korea snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. So when we talk about unification, like Korea's future it's not going to be sort of this smooth glide path. There will be things that will happen. Undeniably, there will be things that will happen that will look tragic, that will look like Korea's again on the precipice, but they always manage to survive, right? They always, like the story that Ramon told about how the World Bank, USAID, right, in the 1950s said the South Korean economy would not advance beyond, like, at best, light manufactured products, right? I mean, these were experts, PhDs, dare I say. That was their assessment of South Korea, the South Korean economy. And look at it today. So I think that's, when we look forward, that's something to be positive about. Not saying it's going to be like perfect, because there will be things that will happen, but they were resilient and they'll always find a way to survive and thrive.
Great note to end it on. Okay, so let's go to our audience. Please raise your hand if you have a question. Okay, we'll run a mic over to you over here, and then we'll get to Micah too.
Hi. Thank you for your talk. I was also a former Korea Society intern, and Korea Society President Tom Burns once told me that Korea Society interns go on to do great things in life, and he gave me one name as an example, and that was Victor Cha. So I hope to follow your footsteps someday. For the past 20 plus years in South Korea, with the exception of one time, every transition of administration, it seems like there's been a big shift in how they approach North Korea relations. And I was curious how you think from the South Korean perspective, North Korean perspective, and also perhaps from the US perspective, perhaps like to what degree is that a hindrance, or how much does that impact an expectation of continued dialogue?
So I think it has shifted. I mean, that is the price of democracy, frankly, right? I mean, Korea has sort of deep political, ideological divides, right, between the right and the left that largely center on, they center on other things, but they're informed by policy towards North Korea, right? They're informed by that, I think. There's nothing we can do about that. I mean, that's just going to be, if you accept that there's democracy in Korea, you have to accept that we'll have these variations in terms of policy towards North Korea. The only thing that I'm concerned about is that is whether the government, whichever side it is preparing the Korean people for unification. Because my view is that unification will not come gradually. It will not be through a so-called soft landing, where the two Koreas will reach some sort of agreement on economic integration, one country, two systems, 30 years, slow integration process. That's not going to happen, because that's not Korea's history, right? Korea's history is always crisis, equilibrium, crisis, equilibrium. That's their history. So as that famous American writer said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And I think that would be the case for Korea. So the question is the government preparing the Korean people for that. If you say that unification is something that is long, we want to push it as far off into the future as possible. We don't want to talk about it. It's a bad thing. It's dangerous. It's difficult. It's expensive. Let's just not focus on that. Let's not create the conditions for that sort of thing. You're not doing a service to your citizens, right? But if you prepare your citizens and say, you may not want unification, but it could happen tomorrow, right? And so are we prepared for that? Whatever your ideology is, I mean, that's the service you have to provide to your citizens. And as elected officials, that's your job, right? So again, my point is like views on North Korean unification will shift with each government, but the most important thing is preparing the people for what I think is an inevitability and one that will come suddenly, right? It'll come suddenly.
So if people are curious and want to learn more about unification coming this fall, where might they turn to?
All right, now that you mentioned it, John, so if you want to learn more about unification, there's another book coming out in September by Columbia University Press on unification. So.
And I would just add to that point, because when we talk to people from authoritarian governments, they often say, you democracies, you're unreliable. From one administration to the next, we can't count on you to keep true to your word. But when you look back at the negotiating history between the United States and North Korea, it's not exactly like the North Koreans have always kept true to their word, too. So authoritarian governments also do not have a perfect track record of staying true to their commitments. Micah, you had a question. We'll get a microphone out to you.
Thank you so much. My name is Maika from Japan, and last time I think I bumped with Professor Chow was on the Japanese Asahi Shimbun, like you are the discussant, I was discussant, and so it's great to meet you finally in person. So like my question is how in this, if you see all the history of the relationship with Soviet and North relationship with Soviet Union and South relationship Soviet Union, and current Russian relationship between Russia and North, Russia and South. Do you think you interpret it's kind of totally new, the current Russia and North and South relationship is something totally new, or you see some remnants or connection from the Soviet and two countries' relationship?
Good question.
Yes, I'll speak on this, and then Ramon, you can speak on the view from Europe. So I think the relationship today certainly has echoes of the past, but it's very different. It's very different because in the past, North Korea was a supplicant in the relationship. They always wanted security guarantees from Soviet Union, fuel, and money. Right, and money and also debt relief from the Soviet Union. So they always wanted things from the Soviet Union. We're now in a situation where Putin literally needs North Korea to survive, right? He cannot sustain the war in Ukraine without North Korean ammunition. 10,000 shipping containers, 3.5 million rounds of ammunition, right, for the war in Ukraine being supplied directly by Kim Jong-un to Putin from Najin port through Dnipro port in Russia, across by rail, across to the west to the Ukrainian war front, 3 major storage ammunition depots. Go to our website. You can be on Parallel. You can see the whole thing mapped out. So now we're in a situation where Russia needs North Korea. It's never been the case before. And there's lots of concern about what Putin is supplying to North Korea, aside from food and fuel, in return for ammunition and ballistic missiles.
Yeah. And I mean, in Europe, the war is in our continent, right? And we live it. So I mean, my daughter's school, we have refugees from Ukraine, right? Whose fathers are fighting in the front and may be killed. You know, they may go home and they might not have a father. So we feel it very personally. So what happens here is that South Korea, as you probably saw in the Washington Post a few months ago, has been the largest single supplier of ammunition to Ukraine via Poland and the US last year, right? More than all European countries combined. So as you can imagine, many Europeans, especially at the political level, they feel very thankful to South Korea. It's one of the very few countries, you come from Japan, you said, Japan, another country, one of the very few countries at the global level really supporting a country that's been invited by another, right? That doesn't believe that this country should be independent and sovereign, right? But for us, I mean, from here it's like, well, it's a war on the side of the Atlantic. For us, something we live on a daily basis. So this has really helped South Korea's stock to rise significantly in Europe, as you can imagine. Not only in Ukraine, not only Central Eastern Europe, but also in the UK where I live, other Western European countries, and vice versa with North Korea. Europeans have always had many problems with North Korea, obviously, nuclear weapons, human rights, right? The political system of North Korea. But now the number one issue that Europeans have with North Korea is its support for Russia, right? You may have seen some European countries thinking about reopening the embassies in Pyongyang. Germany, for example, sent a delegation from the foreign ministry 3-4 weeks ago. And the key reason why they want to go back, European countries, is to tell to North Korea, this is not right, right? You are helping Russia kill Europeans, right? Yes, you repress your own population, you proliferate nuclear technology, weapons of mass destruction, but you're actually killing Europeans, right? So it has become quite significant for the way Europe sees the two Koreas and the relationship with both of them. Very positive in the case of the South, and the North. This is really the number one issue: what the North is doing with Russia. So this will have repercussions for the certainly in the short term, but I think also in the long-term future, as long as Putin is in power in Russia, this will continue to be an issue.
Do we have one more? I'd like to get one from our BARD students in the back. Our BGI, yeah, there's one from a BGIA student, right?
Hi. On the topic of unification, sorry. Under what circumstances do you see it happening? Would there have to be a change in leadership from North Korea, or do you see also any international key players making a move to influence both countries towards unification? Yeah, and if so, do you see that being either Russia or United States?
Mm-hmm.
So I only really see two ways unification could happen. One would be somehow the North Korean leadership ends, right? In this this family leadership thing ends, right? That's one way. Because I think even if North Korea were run by a military dictator, as I said earlier, I think with a military dictator in North Korea, there's still opportunities for rational economic decisions that could include economic cooperation with South Korea. But with a cult of personality leadership, it's not possible. So that would be one. The other would be if China opened its border. If China let North Koreans vote with their feet, that would be the end. That would be the absolute end. So there's a reason why China sweeps up all the North Korean migrants that make their way into China and sends them back across the border in the middle of the night. There's a reason they do that, right? Because they know that if they open their border, that would be the end, right? North Koreans could vote with their feet, they'd go across the Yalu, and the regime would no longer exist. So those would be the two that I would think of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would add on the first scenario that Victor mentioned. The Kim regime has been there since 1948, so for us, unthinkable that it will disappear. But of course, we thought the same in the Soviet Union, and then it collapsed. We thought the same in Central Eastern Europe, it collapsed. We thought the same in South Korea, Taiwan, Spain, Greece, Portugal, other dictatorships in which there was a leader or this authoritarian leadership for decades and decades. And we thought, well, this is a country that's very stable, right? In the Soviet Union, you have all these books from 1988, 89, talking about the next 30, 40 years of the Soviet Union, people who were studying the country and had more access to the Soviet Union, as little as they had, than we have to North Korea. For me, it's interesting because when you meet with when I had the opportunity to meet with North Korean officials in track 1.5 to dialogues, the biggest fear is what happened in Libya, what happened in Iraq, what happened in Afghanistan, right? These regimes that collapse, right? And yes, in these cases there were external intervention, but they also fear what happened in Central Eastern Europe in the 1980s and 1990s. They also fear the Arab Spring, because these were internal movements, right, that led to a change in leadership that 2 days before, right, people thought was impossible. If you look at Tunisia, tourists were going to Tunisia 2 days before. There were many scholars going to Tunisia. No one expected, right, that suddenly this will ignite the Arab Spring. One single person, one of many different people who were unhappy with the economic conditions of the country, and this led to regime change. So do mention this scenario obviously in the book, because as unlikely as it looks to us here, sitting down today on the 18th of April, right? Who knows? Maybe tomorrow we wake up and suddenly something has happened in North Korea, and there has been a change in government. We also make the point in the book that we wouldn't be surprised if we have this talk in 20 years' time and we're still talking about the Kim family, a fourth generation of the Kim family, or even the current leader, right? We simply don't know, but it's something that we shouldn't say will never happen, because we thought it wouldn't happen in authoritarian regimes, and then it happened.
Maybe leader Kim Joo-ae by that point.
Who knows? Could be.
Okay, so clearly this book has inspired lots of interest and excitement. It's for sale in the back, $33. Get your book, purchase it. You can get it autographed by the authors themselves. We've also got some food for you, so please hang around with us afterwards. I've got some people to thank. Our wonderful interns, Tashi and Heiji. Please help me give them a round of applause. Thank you so much. Chelsea in the back there working so hard to make this happen. Peter and Bradley doing the production. Thank you so much. Thank you, Peter and Bradley. Our wonderful authors, Victor and Ramon. Thank you so much. Crushed it. And last but not least, give yourself a round of applause. You came out. It was not a great day weather-wise. You came out anyway. Good job. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you.